doing a DVD recording of a practice interview. I was just going to ask you questions about how you discovered your son had autism.
Well, I didn't discover that Caden had autism. I thought he was normal because he was my first child and I didn't really know what to expect as a new mom. Excuse me. When my son started going to school, the behavior problems were more prominent. He would bite into things and tear things apart, and it was him sensory seeking, whereas most adults would think he's just being a bad boy. And so he was referred for a psychological eval. And in my mind, I was terrified. I didn't know what to. A psychological eval, those are a lot of big words for a new mom. And so I went to the psychological evaluation with Caden, and it was a 2-day process. And I sat as a doctor, interviewed my son with very different types of tests and puzzles and stuff like that. And I didn't know what was going to come of it. In my mind, I was hoping that they were going to tell me that there's nothing wrong with my son. He's perfectly normal and he'll grow out of this. It's a phase, or, that it wasn't going to be something scary.
Was there any speech patterns that you thought were a little odd?
Caden didn't start talking until he was about 2. What I did notice about his speech patterns wasn't so much to do with speech, but he would babble a lot. He would make siren noises, and it wasn't him communicating. It was him just wanting to make noise. If it was too quiet in the house, he was compensating by making a lot of noise.
Okay. When I noticed this past year that you had him in a place over in Anchorage, why did you decide on that placement?
Well, there's history there. His first placement was back in 2010. I didn't understand much about autism, and I certainly didn't understand that changes would trigger certain behaviors. We had gone through a major change in 2010 where we had to move from our hometown of Malacala, and what I didn't understand was how this was going to affect Caden, and I was caught completely off guard. Caden started to have some psychological features where he was hearing voices or seeing things, and so when I actually reached out to the person who did the psychological eval, to that doctor, and I asked, what can I do? This is happening and I'm terrified. And she recommended that I bring Caden to the hospital, and then the hospital actually recommended that Caden go to a 30-day intensive hospital called North Star Behavioral Health. And that was his first time ever really being away from me. It was 30 very long days and very difficult days. And then Caden started to do some outpatient treatment in Ketchikan. And I thought, that was going to be the worst that we'd ever go through. Well, then we moved back home, another major change, and difficulties arised in school for Caden. I think a lot of it had to do with people just not understanding autism. I didn't really understand autism. I was researching, and there's really no amount of research that's going to tell you about your one autistic child, because every autistic child is different. Every child with autism is different. You raise them.
So educating him, I found with my own son that the education, what would fit for one autistic child will not fit for another.
Yes.
And that's why it's called an individual education program.
Right.
Or plan.
There's very little resources in Metlakatla for someone on the spectrum. And even with what resources were available, uh, Caden was just not succeeding in school, and the school seemed to focus on his behavior more than his education, and when that became the focus, Caden's very smart.
Mhm.
He picked up on what was happening with school, and so he knew that if he didn't want to do something in particular, or if something was too hard, that his way to get out of it was to have a meltdown. And some of his meltdowns, I think, were legitimate meltdowns,
Mhm.
but some of them, I think, were very planned.
He played the system.
He did. And the sad and hard part about that was that by the time we had recognized what was happening, it was too late. And Caden was not going to fit into a mainstream classroom, and he was very isolated for actually a couple of school years. So Caden ended up going back to North Star 3 other times, and after the 3rd time, the doctor recommended long-term treatment. And what made me decide to agree to that was I wanted to see what another school would do for my son, because I knew there had to be something different. And he went to a special day school where a lot of the children had an IEP and an ESER, and I didn't even know what an ESER was before that.
What is it?
I still don't really know. But it has to do with eligibility. So there's an IEP that helps individualize an education plan for a child who needs it, but then there's ESER, which makes them eligible for other services that the school can and by law should provide. So one of those services is Caden has an aide that is with him every single moment of his day at school, and that has really helped him succeed this year. There's also other programs like speech and language therapy that the school must provide for Caden, and the eligibility report, the ESER, shows that he has already been deemed eligible to receive those services. So by law, the school has to provide the services. If they don't have it, they have to find it and they have to provide it. So
He's doing better this year then.
he is doing a lot better this year.
Because I know at the beginning of the year when you talked to me that you were scared, really scared for him.
Yes, I was scared for all of us. When Caden's not in our home, we're not a full family.
No.
We went an entire 9-10 months without him last year, and our house was very lonely. And as a mother, I could not walk into his bedroom. His bedroom stayed the same. The same dirty clothes that were on the floor the day that he left were on the floor when he came back, because it was too hard for me to go into his room. And we grieved for that amount of time that he was gone. We were very fortunate to have the funding to bring him home for Christmas. That was not provided with his insurance or anything like that. Our Christmas was to bring Caden home.
Oh, that's nice.
So, we have, the hard part of this is trying to figure out the financial aspects of it, because as a mother, I worked hard to provide financially for my children. I was a single mom for a long time, and so I take my responsibility as a parent very seriously, and I don't expect anyone else to take care of my children. So I work really hard, and that gives me an edge financially to provide for them, but when it comes to things like services for Caden, they're very expensive. We are under the Indian Health Service Program, but our Indian Health Service Program here in Mount Cal is very limited in terms of behavioral health. So that's been the hardest part of trying to figure out what Caden is eligible for to receive. In the state of Alaska, you have to meet 5 different eligibility requirements in order to get extra help from the state. Caden doesn't meet those requirements at this time. He he will when he's older, but since he's being taken care of here in Mount Ocala by his family. So those were some of the reasons why we decided to follow through with the long-term care for Caden, was to see what a mainstream school with more resources and more funding and, you know, more experts would do differently with Caden, to see what sort of resources he would qualify for under the state, since he was, since it was deemed necessary for him to go to long-term care. I thought that would be a good time to say, okay, well, since we don't want him to go back to long-term care next year, what services can we get to keep him home? Because that's the goal of every treatment program, is to reunify the people child in our community. So those were, I think that was the questions.
Yeah, that's pretty much. The other question I had is, your fears, not fears, what are your hopes for the future for him?
I'm kind of taking things day by day.
Okay.
My hope is that tomorrow Caden has a really good day at school, and that he finds another thing of interest that he can focus on. For the future, I hope that Caden can find a job that he likes, to find some form of autonomy. I think he'll always be with me because I turn into Mama Bear with Caden,
Yeah.
and I don't ever want him to leave me.
I think I understand that.
I'm that way with all of my kids, but
Yeah.
especially with Caden, because I just, you know, it's hard for me as a mother not to see his limitations, and I'm afraid what failure might do to Caden.
He's probably a little more resilient than you think. I mean, with my oldest son, I don't want to ever see him go bye-bye, you know, because, that's my baby.
Yeah.
In Caden, we're seeing a lot of successes with him right now, and that's been important for him. Thank you for the interview.
You're welcome.
Thank you for coming over.